Tonight, we step into the sun-drenched, olive oil-slicked world of ancient Greece, a civilization remembered for philosophy, democracy, and an aversion to pants. But behind the legends of Plato, Sparta, and shining marble temples lies a much harsher reality. Because while ancient Greece laid the foundations of Western civilization, life for the average person was a daily grind most of us wouldn't last through today. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe. Only if you truly enjoy this kind of content. Drop a comment to let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. It's always fun to see the global reach of this community. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some soft background noise, and let's settle in for tonight's journey. Welcome to ancient Greece, where your day begins not with an alarm, but with the sun turning your house into a slow cooker. Your home is basic, built from sun-dried mud bricks or rough stones, with small, glassless windows and wooden shutters, more for keeping out the goats than anything else. There's no insulation, no fans, and definitely no personal space, unless you count the corner the family goat doesn't sleep in. You wake up early, not out of self-discipline, but because it's already too hot to stay in bed. The stone walls soak up heat during the day and release it back into your bones at night. In winter, they do the opposite, turning your home into a freezer with little more than a thin sheet to keep you from freezing solid. You probably sleep on a thin mat or a straw-stuffed mattress. No pillow, just a rolled-up cloak or your arm. If the lice didn't bite too much the night before, there's no running water. Your morning starts with a walk to the public fountain, or if you live in the countryside, a trip to the nearest. Well, you carry water in clay jars, balanced on your shoulders, silently begging the gods not to let you drop and break a week's worth of hard work. Bathing? Not part of your morning. If you clean up at all, it's usually at the end of the day. You might splash your face, rub olive oil on your skin, then scrape it off with a strigil, a curved metal blade. Think of it as a minimalist spa routine, just without the spa, the luxury, or the results, and forget privacy. Your family lives, sleeps, and eats together in a single room. You all argue over who tracked in the mud, because your street is also your hallway, your social feed, and your garbage dump. You haven't eaten yet, and already your back hurts. You're sweating, and your tunic is sticking in all the wrong places. And this is the best part of your day, so you've made it out of your oven-like bedroom. Time to fuel up. Breakfast in ancient Greece makes modern intermittent fasting look indulgent. Your morning meal is barley bread, stale, dense, and about as exciting as the dirt it was baked near. It's called matzah, ground barley mixed with water, shaped into flat cakes, and baked on hot stones or in the ashes of last night's fire. Think of it as an ancient granola bar, just without the crunch, flavor, or joy. You might dunk it in watered-down wine, because the water itself isn't always safe to drink. There's no filtration, no boiling, and no clay pot version of a Brita. Everyone, kids included, drinks diluted wine, not for fun, but to stay alive. If you're lucky, you might get a fig, a few olives, or a bit of goat cheese. But odds are, you're not lucky. You're hoping your bread isn't crawling with flies and doesn't chip a tooth. No coffee, no eggs, no fruit bowl, no honey, unless you live near a beekeeper and know how to bribe them. Meals are quick. No chairs, no forks, no mindful eating. You chew, nod, and move on. And if you're a woman, you don't even eat with the men. In many homes, women and children eat separately, and often only after the men are finished. So not only is the food underwhelming, you also get to wait for it. The irony? Ancient Greece gave us symposiums, banquets, and odes to wine, but breakfast? That barely earns a mention. It's dry, plain, often burnt, and yet you chew it down like a hero, because it's all that stands between you and a full day of labor under the sun. After that delightful meal, it's time to freshen up. Though, that's a generous way to put it. Hygiene in ancient Greece isn't about cleanliness. It's more ritual than routine. Soap, not a thing. Your usual bath is cold water poured over your body, usually in public fountains or courtyard basins, unless you live near a rare bathhouse. There's No shampoo, no body wash, and no soft sponge, unless you've stolen one from a diver in the Aegean. What you do have is olive oil. You rub it on your skin, not to hydrate, but to lift the dirt and sweat, then scrape it off with a bronze blade. Picture covering yourself in salad dressing and shaving it off. That's your skincare routine. And if you think that sounds fancy, keep in mind, everyone's doing it, often in public, often loud, naked. Hygiene in ancient Greece is a group activity. Privacy isn't really a thing. Dental care, you're on your own. No brushes or toothpaste. Maybe you chew on a stick, rinse with vinegar, or rub your gums with crushed charcoal. Mostly, you just hope for the best. Body odor? Constant. Deodorant doesn't exist. Perfume does, but only for those who can afford it. A dab of myrrh or rose oil might help right before you walk 5 miles in open sandals through the Athenian heat. The result? A fragrance mix of musk, dust, and pure effort. Laundry? Rare. Clothes are cleaned by beating them on rocks in the river. If you're poor, your tunic likely hasn't touched water since the last festival season. Hygiene in ancient Greece is less about looking fresh and more about seeming slightly less filthy than yesterday. With that behind you, it's time to get dressed. The ancient Greek wardrobe? Minimal and hilariously impractical. You've got two main options, a chiton or a himation, both basically large linen rectangles that you wrap and fasten with a pin or a belt. They're not tailored, they're not secure, and they were definitely not made for windy weather. One sudden gust, and everyone's getting a philosophy lesson they didn't ask for. Underwear doesn't exist. Bras? Same, unless you're a Spartan. Woman trained for combat, you're relying on hope and pins to keep things in place. As for shoes, if you're lucky, you've got leather sandals. If not, you're barefoot, walking across sun-scorched stones, goat-stomped dirt, and whatever the market dropped in the street. Imagine crossing a skillet in July while dodging donkey dung. That's your daily commute. No sunblock, no hat, unless you're a farmer or sailor, and science? Still waiting to be invented. The Aegean sun doesn't care about your intellect. It will fry you by noon. Your shoulders burn, your feet are filthy, and your robe has stuck to you in ways that defy logic. And let's not forget, public nudity isn't shocking in ancient Greece. You might pass men training naked in the gymnasium, or hear politicians speaking in togas, barely clinging to them. If you're wealthy, your tunic might be dyed purple or saffron. But most folks wear dull brown or off-white. Dye is pricey, and nobody's wasting it on the guy who mends fishing nets. So you march through the day dressed like a sunburned burrito, praying your brooch doesn't fail in front of the temple priestess. And here's the kicker. You're only halfway through your to-do list. Welcome to ancient Greece, where military service isn't a career. It's your civic obligation, your expected role, and sometimes your fast track to the underworld. If you're a free male citizen, especially in Athens or Sparta, congratulations, you're automatically a soldier. By your teenage years, you're already training, wooden weapons, tight formations, learning to march in a phalanx shoulder to shoulder, hoping the guy beside you doesn't slip. In Sparta, boys start at age 7 in the brutal agorgy, a system designed to toughen them through deprivation, beatings, and isolation. Athens is less extreme, but still mandatory. 2 years of training in your late teens, followed by years. On standby, you can't opt out. Even philosophers like Socrates fought, with real weapons, not just clever insults, and there's always a war. Sparta versus Athens. Athens versus Persia, Sparta versus anyone who looks at them funny. Peace is just the quiet between two conflicts. Armor, if you can afford it, bronze helmet, chest plate, greaves, a round shield and a spear. If not, good luck. Leather and cloth don't stop arrows, and the worst part, you bring your own gear. Military service is BYOB, bring your own bronze. poorer citizens borrow, beg, or fight lightly armored, which basically means first in line to die. When you're not fighting, you're prepping, training, cleaning weapons, debating in the assembly, or rowing endlessly on warships. Because yes, those triremes don't move themselves, paddling their own boats. No veterans' healthcare, no pensions, no therapy, just injuries, limps, and the occasional poorly etched gravestone praising valor and sacrifice. If you think life as a man in ancient Greece was difficult, just wait until you hear what it meant to be a woman, especially in Athens. Women had fewer rights than decorative pottery. No voting, no public office, no land ownership, and rarely seen in public without a male companion. In fact, if you were spotted out too often, rumors would start. Either you were a courtesan or, worse in Athenian eyes, a Spartan. Let's look at your typical day. You'd rise before dawn to begin housework, spinning wool, weaving, grinding grain, fetching water, baking bread, managing slaves if your household had any, and raising children. You were the household manager, without pay, recognition, or rest days. Your social life was nearly non-existent. You didn't go to the theater, join debates, or visit the gymnasium. That was a space reserved for nude male athletes. Instead, you were confined to the gyneceum, the women's quarter. There were no career politicians. Every eligible man was part legislator, part juror, and part enthusiastic amateur. Powerful roles like overseeing the treasury or serving on a jury were filled by lottery. No experience required. Your local fish seller might be managing military logistics one day. Your superstitious uncle could be judging a murder case the next. If someone became too influential or simply rubbed others the wrong way, ostracism was the solution. Once a year, citizens could inscribe a name on a broken piece of pottery, an ostracon, and vote to exile that person for 10 years. No trial, no defense, just disappear for being too popular. Flawed though it was, Athenian democracy was revolutionary. It gave ordinary men a political voice, at least some of them, and set the stage for future governance. But make no mistake, it was not fair or inclusive. Women, silenced. Foreign-born residents who paid taxes, silenced. Slaves building the Parthenon, silenced. Philosophers who asked too many questions, sometimes executed. Democracy may have been born in Greece, but if you expected equal rights, you'd be shown the door and told to bring your own ostracon. In ancient Greece, slavery wasn't just accepted, it was integral. Even modest homes had at least one slave, not because they were rich, but because owning people was as commonplace as wearing sandals or getting sunburned. Slaves weren't a specific race. They came from conquered regions, Thracians, Scythians, Syrians, and even other Greeks unlucky enough to be on the losing side of a conflict. Some were born into it, others were war captives or kidnapped and sold. It was a booming, ruthless trade. If you lived in Athens, your slave likely handled everything: cooking, cleaning, childcare, shopping. Some even managed household affairs or business dealings while their masters reclined at symposiums, sipping diluted wine and discussing abstract notions of justice. Irony level maximum. In the silver mines of Lorien, slaves, including children, labored in horrific conditions, crawling through tunnels in the dark, breathing toxic dust, and dying slowly in service of currency and civic prestige. A few slaves were educated. They taught grammar and math, managed finances, or worked as scribes. But they were still property. They could be beaten, branded, sold, or killed with no legal recourse. Those who gained freedom, known as freedmen, were never truly free. They still owed allegiance to former masters and were barred from citizenship. No voting, no land ownership. Just a hope for slightly better circumstances. And unlike later eras, there was no large abolitionist movement. Philosophers like Aristotle, even that Aristotle, defended slavery as natural and necessary. According to him, some people were slaves by nature. Enlightening, isn't it? Greece gave the world ethics, politics, and philosophy, but much of it was built by people who had no voice, no rights, and no recognition. That's not a side note. That's the foundation. Feeling unwell in ancient Greece? Tough luck. Unless Hippocrates happened to be your neighbor, your healthcare plan consisted of a few herbs, divine appeals, and a lot of guesswork. Let's begin. With the basics, there were no hospitals as we know them. If you got sick or injured, you stayed home. Maybe a neighbor knew a home remedy. Maybe a relative remembered a healing prayer. Maybe your local temple had a snake to pet for spiritual comfort. That was about it. Greek doctors were part herbalist, part philosopher, part gambler. They believed in the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile. Illness? That was due to an imbalance. Fever, too much blood, get it drained. Coughing, too much phlegm, try fasting. Melancholy, that's black bile. Take a walk or contemplate the sea. Most treatments were trial, error and garlic. You might be prescribed crushed poppy seeds, boiled figs, or a compress made from vinegar and goat scrapings. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. Almost always it hurt. Surgery, rare, terrifying, and only when absolutely necessary. With no anesthesia or antiseptics, even a small wound could turn fatal. Surgical tools included iron knives, bone saws, and inevitably, prayers. Amputation. Better bring a leather strap to bite. Midwives oversaw childbirth, which was dangerous even under ideal conditions. Mortality rates for women and babies were tragically high. One difficult birth could mean death for both mother and child. If you were wealthy, you might hire a traveling doctor, someone with a scroll and some fancy oils. If not, you relied on street cures, neighborly advice, and sheer endurance. Or you simply didn't recover. Still, they did value rest, fresh air, and a balanced diet, so there's that. Greek medicine gave us the Hippocratic Oath. It also gave us remedies like drink boiled cabbage water. So yes, healthcare in ancient Greece was mostly herbs, hope, and hanging in there. In ancient Greece, theatre wasn't just for fun, it was a religious event, a civic responsibility, and emotional boot camp. Let's start with the upside. Theatre was free for citizens. If you were a woman, slave, or foreigner, good luck even attending. Crowds filled massive hillside theatres like the one dedicated to Dionysus in Athens, crammed shoulder to shoulder with thousands of others. And you stayed all day. The Dionysia festival ran from sunrise to nightfall with non-stop performances, tragedies, comedies, satyr plays. There were no intermissions, no snacks, and no bathroom breaks unless you wandered off to a nearby bush. Show up late or misbehave, you might get fined. The performances themselves were intense. Tragedies dealt with violence, madness, divine wrath. Whole families ruined by ancient curses and poor decisions. You didn't come to laugh, you came to mourn collectively. Then came the comedies. Not exactly family-friendly, they satirized. Politicians mocked entire cities and took aim at bodily functions. Think of a blend between Saturday Night Live and a philosophy class, except with actors in giant phallic costumes. All actors were male, wearing towering masks, platform shoes, and elaborate costumes. The chorus danced, sang, and shouted commentary, like a live version of Twitter but in tunics, and the audience anything but passive. They shouted, argued, booed, even threw things. Theatre was democracy with a stage. If you hated the play, you voiced it. If you were moved, you wept or cheered. At the end of the festival, a jury voted on the best performances. Imagine spending 3 straight days weeping over Orestes, only to find that the prize went to a bawdy comedy starring a talking pig god. That was ancient Greece for you. Theatre wasn't just something you watched. It was something you lived through. You might even throw an olive or two. After surviving your tragic all-day theatre marathon, you'd wander into the agora, the lively center of the city. and immediately bump into a barefoot man in a cloak asking strangers, "What is justice? Welcome to philosophy." It was everywhere, and in ancient Greece, especially Athens, it was impossible to ignore. Philosophy in Athens wasn't a side interest, it was practically a sport. And the star players, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Today, they're associated with revolutionary thought. Back then, they were mostly eccentric men who made others feel foolish. Socrates, for example, made it his mission to ask endless questions that led nowhere and to unravel people's confidence in their own beliefs. You could be peacefully shopping for olives or petting a stray goat, and suddenly he'd appear, "Do you believe in truth?" I guess. What is truth? And just like that, you're spiraling for hours, wondering if you should just move to Sparta. Socrates never wrote anything down, that was Plato's job, but he left a strong impression. Probably because Athens eventually executed him for being too irritating. Officially, it was for corrupting the youth and impiety, but let's be honest, he probably just wouldn't shut up during dinner. Philosophy wasn't some cozy academic pursuit. It was loud, confrontational, and surprisingly physical. Debates took place in public, were spontaneous and intense, and often ended in emotional wreckage or personal crisis. No microphones, just voices, hand gestures, and enough ego to fill the Parthenon. And if you thought you could just observe, think again. Philosophers loved dragging bystanders into the action. Walk past Plato's academy, and you could become that day's unfortunate example of how not to think. Even kids weren't spared. Aristotle personally tutored Alexander the Great. Imagine your high school civics teacher handing you a globe and saying, "Fix this." Yes, philosophy gave the world logic, ethics, science, and politics. But in ancient Greece, it also gave you a headache, a personal crisis, and a high chance of public embarrassment by a man in sandals. So let's say you've made it in ancient Athens. You're articulate, intelligent, politically involved, and people like you. A bit too much, perhaps. That's your first mistake, because in Athens, being too popular could get you kicked out of the city for a decade. Not imprisoned, not fined, just gone. It wasn't a secret plot. It was part of the law. It was called ostracism, and it was completely legal, entirely public, and absolutely nerve-wracking. Once a year, citizens voted on whether to hold an ostracism. If the vote passed, they'd write a name on a broken piece of pottery, an ostracon. If someone got 6,000 or more votes, they were exiled. No trial, no justification, just grab your sandals and leave. You didn't have to break any laws. In fact, many who were ostracized were admired. War heroes, great speakers, or people with enviable hair. It didn't matter if enough people decided you were becoming a danger to democracy. Democracy voted to send you into temporary exile. But here's the twist. It wasn't forever. Ostracism lasted 10 years. After that, in ancient Greece, dying young wasn't a surprise. It was a question of how soon and how painfully. Life expectancy hovered between 30 and 35 if you made it past infancy. And many didn't. About 1 in 3 children didn't survive. Childhood, thanks to disease, malnutrition and hygiene that was more idea than reality. You could die from just about anything. An infected cut, a mystery fever, childbirth, a leading cause of death for women, or even something as random as drinking the wrong water. Medicine was limited, and divine help was, let's say, unreliable. Cities were breeding grounds for illness. Crowded homes, public sewers, and shared fountains made epidemics a common part of life. The plague of Athens during the Peloponnesian War wiped out 1/3 of the population. Thucydides wrote about it, then he caught it, then he somehow survived. War. Constant. If you were a man, you were likely to die holding a spear or rowing a trireme, and even if you survived the battle, your wounds might kill you days later. No antibiotics, no stitches, just hope and garlic. There was also the risk of offending the gods. Forget a sacrifice, insult a statue, or grumble about Zeus after 3 glasses of wine, and you could end up smitten by lightning, plague, or an angry goat stampede. Funerals mattered. Without proper rites, including coins for the ferryman and offerings, you risked being buried in an unmarked ditch. Spiritually speaking, that was dangerous. The Greeks believed unburied souls wandered restlessly, stuck between worlds. Death wasn't poetic, it was ordinary, and it didn't care if you were a philosopher, a poet, a soldier, or a slave. You could still die from a moldy fig or a mosquito in a bad mood. Greek religion, in theory, was about divine harmony. You worshipped Zeus, Hera, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, and the rest. In practice, it was daily spiritual damage control. These weren't peaceful, all-loving gods. They were powerful, temperamental beings with long memories. Skip a sacrifice, ruined crops, say the wrong prayer, your ship sinks, enter a sacred grove without permission, snake bite. Or worse, they didn't just want devotion, they wanted it done right. That meant perfectly timed offerings, accurate rituals, and constant vigilance. Religion wasn't weekly, it was daily. Household altars, seasonal festivals, civic ceremonies. You prayed to Demeter before planting, offered to Ares before battle, and made sacrifices to Poseidon before a sea trip, often including wine and sometimes goats. Each god had favorites and enemies. Apollo might protect your city, unless your grandfather once offended him. Hera oversaw marriage and made life miserable for any mortal woman Zeus noticed. Athena rewarded wisdom, but also turned people into spiders. Casually, and the Olympians weren't alone. Spirits, nymphs, satyrs, and monsters were everywhere. One wrong step on sacred land, and suddenly you owed your leg to an angry woodland entity. Worst of all, you never knew why something bad happened. Wrong offering, wrong time, dream insult, something your cousin did. Didn't matter. The gods operated on mysterious, often petty logic. Still, religion was embedded in everything. Politics, childbirth, festivals, sports. You feared the gods, yes, but you also relied on them. Their temples were city landmarks. Their myths explained storms, love, war, and everything in between. You didn't believe out of faith. You believed for survival. So after all that, the sun-baked homes, the barley bread, the blistered feet, the war, the gods, the diseases, the goat attacks. Let's ask the big question, would you survive? A single day in ancient Greece, honestly? Probably not. You'd fold by lunch. The heat, the food, the risk of divine wrath, all of it would obliterate your idealized toga fantasy in seconds. You're not used to hauling water before breakfast or squatting next to a temple goat. You'd miss your aspirin, your tap water, your freedom to rant online without being exiled by pottery vote. Sure, you dream of marble statues, brilliant philosophers, and epic poetry, but those were the elite. For most people, ancient Greece was exhausting labor, limited rights, and too many funerals. Your democracy? Only if you were a male citizen. Your medicine? Garlic and hope? Your Twitter feed? A man yelling about justice while holding a fish in the agora? And yet, the Greeks endured. They built monuments that still stand, wrote plays we still perform, posed questions we still debate. They shaped science, ethics, and astronomy while sweating under the Mediterranean sun. You wouldn't last. But they did. Not because life was easy, but because they made meaning from the chaos. They questioned everything, they fought constantly, and somehow they changed the world anyway. She wrote beautifully, died young, and yet still helped shape the modern world. So no, you probably wouldn't survive your first sunstroke, a goat bite, or an unexpected philosophy debate in the street. But if you did, if you adapted, endured, and listened, you'd find yourself among some of the most passionate, resilient, and deeply flawed people history has ever known. And they wouldn't scorn you for struggling. They'd toss you a tunic, point toward the amphory, and say, "Good, now carry that up a hill." It began with a death and a betrayal, Prasutagus, king of the Iceni tribe in what is now Eastern England, had played Rome's political game carefully. For years, he ruled as a client king under Roman oversight, granted autonomy, wealth, and peace, so long as he remained useful. But when he died around 60 AD, he left a will he hoped would safeguard his people, naming the Roman emperor co-heir alongside his two daughters. It was a gesture meant to secure their future through loyalty. But Rome didn't honor the will. Rome didn't bargain. Rome simply took. The Romans annexed the Iceni kingdom without pause. Soldiers arrived, seizing land, livestock, homes, and valuables. But it wasn't the theft that sparked the fire. It was what followed. The Roman authorities publicly flogged Queen Boudica, not just to punish her, but to send a clear message: you are nothing. Then, in front of her, they assaulted her daughters. It was more than suppression. It was psychological warfare, aimed at erasing her spirit. But Boudica wasn't broken. She was transformed. Rome thought it had crushed a minor tribal queen beneath its boot. Instead, it had awakened a lioness, a mother, a ruler who would turn her suffering into fire and set cities alight. A woman about to teach Rome that even empires bleed. News of the atrocity spread fast. Other tribes heard it and remembered. They recalled their own defeats, their stolen lands, their fallen sons. Rome had assumed the Britons were divided, scattered, leaderless. But in that moment, they shared one thing: Boudica's fury. What began as Rome violating a queen would end with the empire reeling. Rome had shattered a treaty, a family, and, in doing so, the illusion of its invincibility in Britannia. This wasn't just a blunder. It was the spark that lit one of the fiercest uprisings Rome would ever face. If they thought Boudica would disappear quietly, they had misunderstood her entirely. Boudica was not born to submit. She was born to lead. Even Roman historians, who rarely praised their enemies, described her as tall, fierce, with fiery red hair flowing to her waist and a voice that could cut through a crowd like a horn in battle. She wasn't just a queen by blood. She was becoming a symbol, and now a serious threat. But before she led a revolt, she became something else, a mother with nothing left to lose. Rome had tried to erase her dignity, her children's future, and her people's identity. But Boudica refused victimhood. She recognized that Rome's greatest fear wasn't just resistance, it was unity, so she began building it. One tribe at a time. The Trinovantes were first. Once powerful, they'd been beaten down by taxes, land seizures, and forced labor. Boudica didn't come to them as a politician. She came as a wounded warrior, speaking not from strategy, but from pain, and they heard their own suffering in her words. Then others began to rally, the Corieltauvi, the Cornovi, and even some of the Brigantes. What began as revenge became a mission to purge Roman arrogance from their land. She didn't offer safety. She offered honor, and if needed, a noble death. They followed her, not because she stood behind them, but because she rode with them, spear in hand, hair wild, gaze fixed on what lay ahead. She called out the names of the violated, the enslaved, the executed. She invoked the war goddess Andraste, and her people believed the gods marched beside them. She had no formal training, no scrolls on Roman tactics. But she had something far more dangerous, righteous anger, sharpened by betrayal and driven by purpose. The ground itself seemed to shift with her arrival. This wasn't rebellion, it was resurrection. The queen Rome thought it had silenced was now the vanguard of a rising storm. The Roman eagle had long soared over Britannia, but the winds were shifting. Boudica's fury wasn't random chaos. It was a storm gathering direction and power, and that power came from thousands of Britons who had waited, generations even, for someone to rise. Not speaking Latin, but speaking through blood and iron. She became that voice. War councils met in sacred groves under moonlit skies. Boudica didn't sit on a throne. She stood in the mud with her people. She listened to elders' anger, to mothers' grief, to druids reading signs in the heavens. They all agreed Rome had gone too far. It was time to strike back. The Trinovantes brought slings and war cries. The Asini provided fast cavalry, wild riders with painted faces and fierce hearts. More tribes joined in, bearing axes, blades, and torches. Even the women fought, following. A queen who had lost everything. This was no ordinary army. This was Celtic identity reborn. Rome had legions, professional W. She addressed them for the first time. Roman historians preserved her speech, though likely with bias. Still, what survives is unmistakable. She vowed victory or death. There would be no surrender, no backing down. The first target, Camulodunum. Once a proud tribal capital, now a Roman colony filled with villas and temples. The temple of Claudius stood as an insult, built with forced labor to honor the emperor who had conquered them. To Boudica's people it wasn't holy. It was a taunt. It would fall first. The whispers of rebellion were over. Her people were. Marching Camulodunum was doomed, a city that had come to represent everything the Britons hated. Latin commands echoed in the streets. Roman monuments stood atop sacred ground, and towering above all was the Temple of Claudius, a marble shrine. To submission, to Boudica, it was a beacon. She gave the order. What followed wasn't a battle. It was an execution. Her army descended like a tidal wave. The Roman settlers, many former soldiers who had oppressed local tribes, were unprepared. The city lacked proper walls. Its garrison was small and poorly trained. They tried to hold out in the temple. They didn't last. Within 2 days, the temple was breached. The streets ran red. No one was spared, men, women, or children. The violence was not random, it was purposeful. Boudica's war wasn't just about winning. It was about justice as she saw it. Her warriors toppled statues, torched homes, and turned their wrath on the very symbols of occupation. The temple collapsed in a roaring fire that lit up the sky. Few survived. Those who did fled with tales that terrified the Romans. This was not madness, it was payback. The stolen homes, the mocked gods, the brutalized daughters, now returned. With interest, Roman officials sent urgent messages to Governor Suetonius, who was in Wales handling another uprising. By the time he heard, Camulodunum was ash. But Boudica didn't linger. She pressed forward, knowing Rome would respond, and fast. She needed to stay ahead. Her next target was even bigger, Londinium. If Rome hadn't taken her seriously before, they would now. Camulodunum had been symbolic, but this would strike at the empire's heart. Londinium, founded only 17 years earlier, had grown into a thriving hub. Markets buzzed with trade, imperial administrators handled business, and money flowed freely. But as Boudica approached, panic set in. Governor Suetonius arrived just ahead of her with a small force. He surveyed the sprawling, vulnerable city and made a harsh call: retreat. He didn't have enough men to defend it, so he withdrew, taking those who could flee. He left behind the sick, the elderly, the doubtful, those who didn't believe. A woman-led force could topple Rome. They were wrong. Boudica's army swept into Londinium. No walls to climb, no gates to smash. The city was exposed, and she made it pay. They didn't loot. They erased. Families were dragged out. Whole neighborhoods butchered. Some were impaled, others burned alive. Villas, warehouses, everything went up in flames. Smoke curled into the sky like a warning to Rome. You are not untouchable. Historians like Tacitus and Cassius Dio estimate tens of thousands died. Some say it was worse than Camulodunum. To the Roman mind, this wasn't rebellion. It was collapse. And Through it all rode Boudica, standing in her chariot, flanked by her daughters, watching the empire tremble. This wasn't chaos to her, it was balance. It was justice for what Rome had done to her people, her family, and her land, and she wasn't done. Next was Verulamium. Then Rome's full response. Rome had faced rebellions before. It had fought across continents, but never had it seen someone like Boudica. She wasn't a general, didn't speak Latin, didn't wear polished armor, but she had already reduced 2 cities to ruins and slain thousands, civilians and soldiers alike. Now, with Verulamium in flames, even Emperor Nero began to panic. Reports say he considered abandoning Britannia entirely. Imagine that, an emperor thinking of retreat, not from another empire, but from a queen. They wrote poetry, died young, and still helped shape the modern world. So no, chances are you wouldn't last through your first heat stroke, goat bite, or unsolicited street philosophy lesson. But if you did, if you adapted, endured, and truly listened, you'd find yourself among some of the most passionate, resilient, and deeply human figures in history. And they wouldn't mock your struggle. They'd hand you a tunic, point to the amphora, and say, "Good, now carry that up the hill." This story begins with a death and a betrayal. Prasutagus, king of the Iceni tribe in what is now eastern England, had managed to survive under Roman rule. He had ruled as a client king, balancing loyalty to Rome with relative autonomy. In return, he gained peace and prosperity until his death around 60 AD. In an attempt to protect his people, Prasutagus named both the Roman emperor and his 2 daughters as joint heirs in his will, hoping his loyalty would secure their future. He was wrong. Rome ignored the will. There was no negotiation, no diplomacy. The empire simply took control. Roman forces annexed the Iceni lands without hesitation. They seized property, livestock, homes, and wealth. But worse than theft was what came next. To send a clear message, Roman authorities publicly flogged Queen Boudica. Then, in front of her, they violated her daughters. This was no simple show of force. It was psychological warfare, designed to break not just her body, but her will. But it didn't break Boudica. It transformed her. Rome believed it had crushed a minor provincial queen. In reality, it had awakened a force far greater, a mother who would turn pain into purpose and grief into fire. A woman who would set cities ablaze and remind an empire that even giants can bleed. News of the outrage spread quickly. Other tribes remembered their own losses, confiscated lands, slain sons, broken deals. Rome had assumed the tribes were scattered and submissive, but now they had a common symbol, Boudica's fury. Rome's cruelty had torn apart a treaty, a family, and the illusion of its own invincibility in Britannia. This wasn't just a political misstep, it was the spark that would ignite one of the most brutal uprisings the Roman Empire ever encountered. Rome expected Boudica to fall silent, but Boudica was never meant to obey. She was meant to lead. Even Roman historians, who rarely praised their enemies, described her as tall and fierce, with long red hair flowing to her waist and a voice that cut through crowds like a war horn. She wasn't just a queen by lineage. She was a force of nature, and now she was a threat. Before she led a revolt, she became something even more powerful, a mother with nothing left to lose. Rome had tried to erase her dignity, her family's future, and her people's identity. But Boudica understood what the empire feared more than any army, unity. So she began to build it, tribe by tribe. She first approached the Trinovantes, once powerful but now crushed under Roman taxation and forced labor. Boudica didn't come to them as a polished diplomat. She came as a battle-scarred mother. She reminded them of their ancestors, their gods, and the land they no longer called their own. Her pain mirrored theirs. Her rage became theirs. Soon other tribes listened, the Corieltauvi, the Cornovi, even parts of the Brigantes. What started as revenge became something larger, a spiritual mission to rid Britannia of Roman arrogance. She didn't promise safety, she promised honor even if it meant death. They followed her not because she ordered them from a throne, but because she rode beside them, spear in hand, hair wild, eyes forward. She invoked the names of the violated, the enslaved, and the slain. She called upon Andraste, the Celtic goddess of war, and her warriors believed the gods stood with them. Boudica had no formal training, no Roman playbook, but she wielded something far more dangerous, a righteous fury refined by betrayal and driven by purpose. The very land beneath her seemed to rise with her cause. This wasn't just rebellion. It was resurrection. The woman Rome thought it had crushed now led a movement that would bring the empire to its knees. And she was only beginning. Rome's symbol, the eagle, had long flown above Britannia. But now the winds that carried it had shifted. Boudica's uprising wasn't a sudden fire. It was a storm gathering force. That storm was fueled by tens of thousands of Britons, people who had waited for a leader to defy Rome, not in words, but in fire and steel. And she became that voice. Her campaign began with war councils held beneath sacred groves and moonlit skies. Boudica didn't rule from marble halls. She stood with her people, listening to tribal elders, grieving mothers, and druids who saw signs in the heavens. They spoke one truth. Rome had gone too far. Now it was time to strike back. The Trinovantes brought weapons and battle chants. The Iceni added cavalry, wild-haired and fearless. More tribes arrived with axes, blades, and torches. Even women took up arms, inspired by their queen. This wasn't just an army. It was a revival. Of Celtic pride, Rome, of course, had trained legions, disciplined, well-armed, and lethal. Boudica had to counter them with numbers, terrain knowledge, and something the empire couldn't train. Collective hatred, forged through years of humiliation. Her army swelled into the tens of thousands. Farmers became fighters, hunters became assassins. Even former Roman slaves and mistreated allies joined her. These weren't soldiers seeking pay. They fought for memory, justice, and the right to raise children in freedom. She gave a speech, one of many to come. Roman historians recorded it with their own bias, but her message rings through time. There would be no surrender, no submission, only victory or death. Her first target was Camulodunum, once a tribal center, now a Roman colony filled with temples and statues. The temple of Claudius stood at its heart, honoring the emperor who had conquered them. To Boudica and her warriors, it wasn't sacred. It was an insult, and it would be the first to fall. The tribes no longer whispered rebellion. They marched for it, armed, furious, and led by a queen who refused to kneel. Camulodunum stood no chance. A symbol of Roman power, it was built on sacred ground, crowned by a temple built through forced labor. Boudica gave the order. What followed wasn't a siege. It was an execution. Roman veterans, settlers, and a handful of guards were caught off guard. The city had no walls and was unprepared. They barricaded the temple, hoping it would hold. It didn't. Within 2 days, the temple fell. The streets ran red. No one was spared. Men, women, and children were killed. Boudica's campaign wasn't indiscriminate, it was intentional. Her warriors toppled statues, burned villas, and destroyed the symbols of Roman rule. The temple's roof collapsed in fire. The sky glowed with smoke. Few escaped, and those who did carried tales that chilled the Roman blood. This was calculated vengeance. These were people reclaiming what had been stolen from them by any means necessary. Roman officials sent, desperate, messages to Governor Suetonius, who was far away in Wales, suppressing another revolt. By the time he heard, Camulodunum was gone. Boudica didn't wait to celebrate. She knew Rome would strike back, so she moved quickly, turning her attention to an even bigger prize, Londinium. Camulodunum had been a symbol. Londinium was the empire's heart in Britannia. Founded just 17 years earlier, it had already become a major trade and administrative center. Merchants filled its streets, wealth moved through it like a river. But as Boudicca's army approached, that prosperity turned to panic. Governor Suetonius, having returned with a small force, saw the city and made a brutal call. He abandoned it. The legions were too far away. Londinium couldn't be defended, so he evacuated the able-bodied, leaving behind the elderly, the sick, and those who underestimated a woman-led revolt. They would soon realize their mistake. Boudicca's army entered Londinium without resistance. No walls, no gates, just Roman pride ready to fall. Her forces swept through like a storm. They didn't loot, they didn't occupy, they destroyed. The killings were thorough. Citizens were dragged from homes. Families were slaughtered. Some were impaled, others burned alive in temples. Villas and warehouses went up in flames. Smoke rose into the sky, a dark signal to the empire. Rome is not untouchable. Roman historians like Tacitus and Cassius Dio estimated that tens of thousands died, perhaps even more than in Camulodunum. To the Romans, this wasn't just a revolt, it was a nightmare, and Boudicca rode through it all, on a chariot, her daughters by her side. She watched the empire's pride crumble around her. This was not mindless destruction, it was her justice, and she wasn't finished. Next came Verulamium, a prosperous Roman town northwest of Londinium. It too was burned to the ground. Rome had faced rebellions before. But nothing like this. Boudicca wasn't trained in war, didn't speak Latin, didn't wear gleaming armor, but she had already destroyed 2 cities and killed thousands. The Roman Senate heard the news. Emperor Nero himself reportedly considered withdrawing from Britannia entirely. Imagine that, an empire stretching from Africa to the Alps, brought to the brink by one woman. And she wasn't done yet. In Ayurveda, Vata governs movement, Pitta oversees, transformation like digestion, and Kapha provides structure and stability. Each person is born with a unique balance of these 3 doshas. Illness, according to Ayurvedic principles, begins when this balance is disrupted, whether by poor diet, stress, environment, or lifestyle. Ancient texts such as the Charaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita, written over 2,000 years ago, serve as comprehensive medical manuals. They cover not only herbal medicine, but also surgery, obstetrics, mental health, and even physician ethics. Charaka focused on internal medicine, emphasizing prevention as the first step in treatment. Sushruta, on the other hand, is remembered as a surgical pioneer. He described over 300 surgical techniques and more than 120 instruments, many crafted from wood or metal. One of his most notable achievements was an early form of rhinoplasty, rebuilding a nose using skin from the cheek or forehead. This wasn't cosmetic, but was used to restore faces disfigured as punishment, centuries before similar techniques emerged in the West. Still, Ayurveda's greatest strength lies in its holistic view. The mind, body, and soul are treated as inseparable. Its practices include herbal remedies, yoga, breathing exercises like pranayama, oil massages, abhyanga, and mindful fasting. Plants like turmeric, ashwagandha, neem, and tulsi were more than nourishment. They were protectors of life force. An Ayurvedic healer might address a fever not only with herbs, but by adjusting sleep, evaluating emotional well-being, and supporting digestion, or Agni. Ayurveda teaches that we are not apart from nature. We are nature. Illness is a call to restore harmony with it. In ancient China, health was seen not just as a matter of flesh and blood, but of energy, specifically qi, pronounced qi, the invisible life force flowing through all living things. Maintaining health meant ensuring this energy moved freely, without excess or blockage. This concept became the foundation of traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, one of the world's oldest and most enduring medical systems. Ancient Chinese physicians first studied nature to understand health. They observed the seasons, lunar cycles, animal behavior, and the cosmos. From these, they developed two core principles, yin and yang and the five elements, wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. Yin represented coolness, darkness, and inward energy. Yang symbolized heat, brightness, and outward force. Every organ and emotion was linked to these complementary forces. Health meant keeping them in balance. A fever, for example, indicated excess yang, while fatigue could mean depleted yin. Diagnosis was deeply sensory. Doctors examined the tongue, felt the pulse in various locations, listened to the patient's voice, and asked about dreams, emotions, and digestion. Every clue offered insight into the body's internal balance. To restore harmony, they used a broad range of techniques. Acupuncture inserted fine needles into precise meridian points to unblock qi. Moxibustion, or burning the mugwort. Herb was used to warm and stimulate energy flow. Other treatments included cupping, herbal formulas, movement practices like qigong, and strict dietary plans. The Huangdi Neijing, or the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon, compiled around 2,000 years ago, remains central to TCM. It went beyond listing ailments, delving into causes, lifestyle, and prevention. It taught that emotions, like anger, sadness, or fear, could affect organ health. Thus, emotional and physical healing were treated as one. Chinese medicine never separated the individual from their environment. Healing meant caring for the climate around you, the energy within, and the soul that connected them. In ancient Greece and Rome, medicine began to shift from divine interpretation to reason and observation. Still, health was seen as a delicate balance. At the core of this worldview was the theory of the four humours, introduced by Hippocrates and later refined by Roman physician Galen. This theory held that the body was governed by four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, each linked to an element: air, water, fire, and earth, respectively. These humours also corresponded to temperaments. Health meant keeping them in balance. Too much yellow bile, for instance, could lead to fever and irritability, a choleric state. Excess phlegm was associated with sluggishness and pallor, suggesting a cold, moist imbalance. Treatments focused on restoring harmony through bloodletting, purging, specific diets, and baths. Greek medicine also valued observation and the patient's surroundings. The Hippocratic Oath, still referenced today, urged physicians to do no harm, observe carefully, and treat the whole person, not just symptoms. Hippocrates encouraged students to consider the seasons, winds, water quality, and even a patient's mood. Healing sanctuaries dedicated to Asclepius, the god of medicine, were scattered across Greece. These weren't just hospitals, they were spiritual retreats. Patients engaged in rituals, exercised, followed dietary regimes, and prayed. At night, they slept in sacred chambers, hoping to receive healing dreams. Roman medicine advanced further under Galen, a Greek doctor who treated gladiators and emperors. He conducted animal dissections, authored hundreds of medical texts, and helped standardize humor theory throughout the Roman Empire. But healing was never just about ingredients. It was also about intention, ceremony, and reverence. Healers worked with spiritual forces through sweat lodges, vision quests, and drumming circles. Some illnesses were believed to be caused by spiritual disturbance or soul loss, where a part of the person's essence had retreated due to trauma. In such cases, rituals like soul retrieval were used, involving chanting, dancing, or guided trance to bring the spirit back. This deep respect for nature is mirrored in indigenous cultures globally. In the Amazon, shamans used powerful plant medicines like ayahuasca, not for recreation, but for insight and healing. The plants were considered teachers, revealing the source of suffering through visions. In Aboriginal Australia, bush medicine included herbs, clays, and practices rooted in the Dreamtime, an ancestral period still central to their identity. Healing involved restoring balance between body, land, ancestors, and sacred songlines. These traditions weren't preserved in books but in dances, stories, and landscapes. To indigenous healers, modern medicine may have machines, but nature was always the first pharmacy. Healing wasn't just about removing disease, it was about remembering who we are. Across all ancient civilizations, regardless of culture, language, or belief, one principle remained constant. Healing required more than surgery or herbs. It required spirit. Whether illness was believed to be divine punishment, soul imbalance, or a breach in sacred order, ancient peoples believed true healing began in the unseen world. And the key to that world was ritual. In Mesopotamia, long before organized medicine, people turned to priests and exorcists to treat illness, which they saw as caused by angry gods or evil spirits. Clay tablets describe healing rituals, combining whispered chants with salves and protective figurines buried beneath homes. Here, ritual was the medicine. In ancient Egypt, no physician treated a wound without first invoking the gods. Before applying honey or wrapping a bandage, prayers were said to deities like Thoth, the god of wisdom, or Sekhmet, goddess of healing. Disease was considered a cosmic imbalance. Healing meant restoring the patient's harmony with Ma'at, the principle of truth, order, and balance. Many African healing traditions follow similar paths. Healers known as Ngangas or Sangomas used drumming, dancing, and divination to identify and cure illness. They communicated with ancestors, entered trance states, and journeyed spiritually on behalf of the sick. Herbs were important, but always secondary to spiritual guidance. Even in classical Greece, ritual played a role. At healing temples to Asclepius, patients underwent purification, fasting, and prayer. They would sleep beneath statues of the god, seeking dreams that priests could interpret for treatment. Ritual was not seen as superstition, but as structure. It gave form to pain and helped people understand that suffering had meaning. Symbolic. Acts allowed people to turn fear into hope, loneliness into connection, and disorder into clarity. Most of all, ritual reminded the ill that they were not alone. Even modern science studies the placebo effect, the power of belief and intention to influence healing. Ancient people didn't need studies to understand this. They knew a word spoken with reverence could heal more deeply than a knife, because not all wounds are visible, and not all medicine comes in physical form. When we imagine ancient surgery, we often picture crude tools and unbearable pain. But the reality was far more skilled and thoughtful. Around the world, early surgeons practiced with surprising precision. Though they lacked anesthesia, antiseptics, or imaging, they relied on sharp observation, courage, and deep anatomical understanding passed through generations. In India, the Sushruta Samhita, written over 2,000 years ago, described more than 300 surgical techniques. Its author, Sushruta, is considered the father of surgery. He detailed procedures for removing tumors, setting broken bones, fixing hernias, and even reconstructing noses, an early form of plastic surgery. His tools were varied and carefully classified: forceps, scalpels, probes, and needles made from metal or stone. Sushruta also emphasized hygiene, proper preparation, and anatomical study, often through animal dissection. His work remains a testament to the precision and humanity of ancient surgical knowledge. Centuries before modern medicine, India's ancient knowledge spread far and wide, influencing both Islamic and Western medical traditions. In ancient Egypt, surgical practice merged with ritual. Medical papyri detail procedures like stitching wounds, treating dislocated limbs, and draining abscesses. Archaeologists have uncovered tools such as bronze knives, bone saws, and cauterizing rods from tombs. Egyptians even practiced trepanation, drilling into the skull to relieve pressure or treat head trauma. Remarkably, many skulls show signs of healing, suggesting that patients often survived. Trepanation wasn't unique to Egypt. In pre-Columbian Peru, archaeologists have found hundreds of skulls bearing evidence of the procedure, particularly among warriors injured in battle. Success rates were unexpectedly high. In some areas, over 80% of patients survived based on bone healing. These early practitioners likely used coca leaves or fermented maize beer to dull pain, along with herbal antiseptics for wound care. In the Greco-Roman world, the physician Galen advanced surgical understanding by studying gladiator injuries and dissecting animals. His observations of the nervous system and blood vessels laid the groundwork for anatomical science. Roman army surgeons treated battlefield injuries with remarkable precision, using tools like clamps and ligatures to control bleeding. Although risky, surgery held respect. It required courage, skill, and the hope that pain could lead to healing. These early surgeons were not crude butchers, but refined craftsmen of the blade. Their incomplete knowledge planted seeds for modern surgical tradition. Each time a scalpel is used to heal, their legacy lives on. Today, we live in a world defined by digital imaging, robotic procedures, and genome mapping. A body scan takes seconds. Prescriptions can cross continents with a tap. Yet, echoes of ancient healing remain. Ayurveda is practiced in yoga studios, Chinese herbs line pharmacy shelves, and smudging rituals are held in hospitals to honor cultural traditions. Medical students still take a version of the Hippocratic Oath, just as ancient Greek physicians once did. In modern operating rooms, we use instruments that trace their lineage to Sushruta's iron tools. Concepts such as holistic health, preventative care, and the mind-body connection, now key to integrative medicine, are rooted in ancient systems that saw healing as relational, not mechanical. And today's science increasingly validates what those traditions knew intuitively. Stress, isolation, and emotional trauma weaken immunity, disrupt sleep, and cause physical symptoms. Meditation, once solely spiritual, is now studied for its neurological benefits. Forest bathing, rooted in Shinto and indigenous practice, is prescribed for anxiety. Even the placebo effect, powered by belief, remains a mystery that continues to challenge modern researchers. It's tempting to dismiss ancient medicine as mere superstition or outdated folk knowledge. But a closer look reveals something profound, a worldview where illness wasn't just a malfunction, but a sign of imbalance, a message that the whole self was out of sync. That perspective still matters. Medicine isn't only about diagnosis and treatment. It's also about meaning, reassurance, and being understood. Ancient healers grasped this on an instinctive level. Whether using chants, herbs, needles, or knives, they treated healing as sacred. Today, as we explore artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and personalized medicine, perhaps we aren't leaving the past behind. Perhaps we're circling back to it with new tools, but the same human longing to be whole in body and spirit. Her name drifts through history like a half-remembered melody. Sappho, a poet from the island of Lesbos, born around 630 BCE, her voice once stirred hearts beneath starlit skies. Even in fragments, her words still pulse with longing. Unlike the warriors and rulers of ancient Greece, her fame came not through power, but through emotion. She explored love, envy, beauty, and heartache, capturing fleeting moments, a glance, a blush, a tremble. Her poetry, like pressed flowers, remains fragile yet timeless. We know little of her personal life, No portraits, no letters, only fragments quoted by later writers or salvaged from decayed papyri. Yet these fragments shine. Plato called her the 10th muse. For centuries, translators and poets have tried to piece together her life, an unfinished song made of scattered notes. Sappho was likely born into a noble family on Lesbos, an island in the northeastern Aegean Sea, known for its artistic and intellectual culture. She may have had siblings, a daughter, and political enemies, though records are unclear. Her life spanned exile and return, silence and song. In a time when most women's voices were confined to the home, Sappho made hers heard. She didn't rebel through force, but through beauty. She wrote in Aeolic Greek, in short, lyrical verses meant to be sung with the lyre. Her style was intimate and vivid. "Evening star, you bring back all that the bright day has scattered," she wrote. Lines like these have outlived empires, and though much of her work is lost, burned, buried, or dismissed, what remains shows that she didn't need monuments. Her poetry was the monument. To understand Sappho, we must understand Lesbos, the island that nurtured her voice. Lesbos was no provincial outpost. It was a vibrant cultural center, with its lush valleys, olive groves, and sea winds sea. Her poems are rich with sensuality, but never crude. She wrote of intimacy with painterly care, the curve of a neck, the softness of sleep, the way moonlight glowed on skin. For her, beauty and intimacy were inseparable. Because of this, later, eras often misunderstood her. Some tried to censor her sexuality, others romanticized her heartbreak. But none of that can erase the truth of her voice. Sappho wrote with honesty, grace, and courage about love, not as theory, but as lived experience. Her poems weren't meant to be silently read. They were music for the soul. In ancient Greece, poetry was alive. It was sound, breath, vibration. Sappho mastered the lyric form, short, emotional, and personal, designed to be sung to the lyre. Her work in Aeolic Greek, with its musical rhythm, gave rise to what we now call lyrical poetry. She favored a meter now known as the Sapphic stanza, 3. Long lines followed by a short one like a final sigh. It mirrored the breath of longing. She likely performed for intimate groups, women, students, companions, perhaps even priestesses. These gatherings may have been sacred or educational, but above all, they were spaces where song, feeling, and the body were not separate but whole. Through them, Sappho passed on her craft, creating not just poems, but culture. We can only imagine the sound, the gentle strings, the rise of her voice, listeners held in stillness by every word. Many of her works open like conversations or invocations. "Come to me now, O golden-throned Aphrodite, and free me from hard care." These lines reach toward the divine and deep into the self, and they still resonate. Set them to music today, and they would stir something raw and human. Sappho made poetry into song, and in doing so, reminded the world that every tremble of voice or heartbeat of desire deserves a melody. Hers is one still echoing across the centuries. She became a ghost. Her name survived, but her voice was nearly lost, preserved only through quotations in other authors' works, scattered across grammar books, commentaries, and philosophical treatises. Her poetry endured in fragments, valued more for its linguistic style than emotional depth. Still, the feelings bled through. Then came the papyri. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists excavating Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, uncovered thousands of manuscript scraps. Among them were faded lines of Sappho, verses unseen for over 1,000 years. More discoveries followed. In 2004, a nearly complete poem was found on a papyrus once wrapped around a mummy in Germany. Each find felt like a small resurrection, yet much remains lost. Today we read her in echoes. What we long for isn't just what she wrote, but what she could have said, had history let her speak freely. And perhaps there's something poignant In this fragmented survival, Sappho wrote of impermanence, of fleeting beauty, of moments that vanish like sand through fingers. Maybe it's fitting that her work reaches us not as a monument, but as a mystery, assembled piece by piece by those drawn to her language, her music, and her heart. A voice once thought extinguished still flickers. Sappho's poetry was too candid to avoid judgment. In her time, she was respected, celebrated as a master of lyric verse. Plato even called her the 10th muse, placing her among the divine. But as cultures shifted, her legacy became distorted, silenced, or scandalized, depending on the era. Why? Because she wrote about love, and not the kind history preferred to remember. Much of her poetry expressed affection and longing for women. She praised their beauty, mourned their absence, admitted jealousy, and cherished their closeness. In her world, this wasn't unusual. On the island of Lesbos, especially among aristocratic women, close emotional and possibly romantic bonds were recognized, even honored. But later generations struggled with this. Roman, Christian, and Victorian values clashed with the truth of her work. Rather than acknowledge it, they rewrote it. Medieval scribes ignored her. Renaissance translators softened her tone. Victorians cast her as a heartbroken woman pining for a man, even inventing the myth of her leaping to her death over a ferryman named Phaon, a story absent from any of her actual work. This myth served a purpose: to erase her queerness, to recast her desires as conventional. Some critics reframed her poetry as purely educational or platonic. Others dismissed her entirely as improper. And yet she endured. Even as scandal, Sappho's name persisted. In the 19th century, when discussing same-sex love was still forbidden, her legacy quietly became a symbol. The words sapphic and lesbian, derived from her name and her homeland, emerged as coded terms for female love. Without trying, she became a symbol of resistance, a poetic forebear for those whose love had been silenced. Today, the questions continue. Was she a teacher, a lover, a myth, a threat? But perhaps the more important question is, why are we still uneasy with her truth? Sappho didn't write to be categorized. She wrote what she felt. She described beauty, admitted longing, and expressed it through verse. Her so-called scandal wasn't her behavior, it was her honesty. She dared to voice desire, and for that, history tried to quiet her, but never fully succeeded. If one divine figure hovered over Sappho's life, it was Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and irresistible desire. To Sappho, Aphrodite wasn't just a myth. She was a muse, a confidant, even a companion in joy and sorrow. Many of Sappho's most moving lines are not just about love. They are prayers, pleas, arguments made in poetry when desire became unbearable. In her most famous surviving piece, Ode to Aphrodite, Sappho doesn't just revere the goddess. She addresses her directly, like a trusted friend. Come to me now. If ever you have answered my voice before, free me from hard care, grant what my heart longs to achieve. There's no shame in her vulnerability, no hesitation in her longing. Her love isn't shown as sinful or weak, it's sacred. So sacred. It calls down a goddess from the heavens. In antiquity, Aphrodite was not confined to romance. She embodied attraction, seduction, the ache of distance. Invoking her was acknowledging that love could wound as much as it could uplift. Sappho understood that duality. She didn't idealize love. She inhabited its contradictions. She wrote of its sweetness and its pain, its splendor and its cruelty. In one poem she writes, "Love shook my soul like the wind on the mountain troubling the oak trees." Here love is not gentle, it's fierce, like a storm, a force that grips the soul without warning. By placing Aphrodite at the heart of her emotional world, Sappho elevated desire to something mythic. Her poems blurred the line between personal feeling and divine presence. Through this lens, love became not just a theme, but a kind of worship. To Sappho, Aphrodite wasn't distant. She was a reflection of the soul's intensity, confusion, and beauty. And in every verse, the goddess seems to answer back. Like her poetry, Sappho's death is wrapped in myth. We don't know exactly when she died, how old she was, or where she spent her last days. Some believe she passed peacefully on Lesbos, surrounded by sea and song. Others, especially Roman poets, imagined a tragic end, leaping from a cliff over unreturned love for a ferryman. But this story lacks any historical basis. It's likely another fabrication, crafted to reframe her legacy as a heterosexual tragedy. This narrative served to tame her. It turned a powerful female voice into a victim of unrequited male desire. It was a neat ending, but an inaccurate one. The truth is simpler. Sappho faded quietly, yet her work lived on. For centuries, her poetry was studied by philosophers, quoted by playwrights, and sung across the Greek world. She authored 9 volumes of lyric verse. For a time, her fame stood alongside Homer's, but history is rarely kind to voices that defy its norms. As the Roman Empire rose, and later as Christian moral codes took hold, Sappho's emotional, sensual poetry, especially her love for women, fell out of favor. Her works were no longer copied. Volumes were left to decay. Some believe her poems were deliberately destroyed by early church authorities. By the Middle Ages, her name remained. Her words mostly vanished. It would take more than 1,000 years for fragments to resurface, unearthed from ancient rubbish piles or cited in linguistic manuals. Piece by piece, she re-emerged, not through legend, but through survival. Her death may be obscured by time, but she was never fully erased. She lingered, in fragments, in footnotes, in the stubborn endurance of a voice too powerful to silence. Sappho didn't need a dramatic ending. Her poems were already immortal, and in the spaces where her lines once lived, we still sense her spirit, unfinished but never lost. Though much of her life remains in shadow and her poetry in pieces, her influence has only grown. Like a candle flickering in the dark, her legacy refuses to fade. Across time, readers and artists have rediscovered her. During the Renaissance, scholars pored over her verses, struck by their subtle emotional depth. In the Romantic period, poets like Byron and Shelley evoked her name. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as conversations about gender and identity reignited, Sappho became a symbol of queer resilience, feminine creativity, and emotional truth. Her name lives on in language itself, Sapphic, describing love between women. Lesbian, taken from the island of her birth, now a global identity. These aren't just terms, they're echoes. Proof that a voice can carry through time and reshape how we understand love and expression. Artists still turn to her. Painters have imagined her under moonlight, lyre in hand. Poets continue translating her, searching for the rhythm beneath the words. Modern writers have reimagined her life in books, songs, and plays. And through it all, On